the roundtable to have a seat in what is as similar to a roundtable as possible in this setting. As you can see from the number of chairs, and you saw already on the program, there is quite a treat in the last session of this conference in terms of the number of speakers and I'm sure valuable contributions. Now, because this is a roundtable session, it will have a slightly different format to the panels before, in the sense that there will not be a moderator to keep things proper and in check. So you will be your own regulators in terms of fitting with the scheduler. The initial proposition was for each of you to have a 5-minute intervention. Now, with the mention that you can intervene several times if you wish. The moderator ad hoc will serve in this panel one of the speakers, and I will kindly ask each of you to present yourselves before you talk. And one final mention: my name is Clara Volintiru. I will be one of the 2 rapporteurs of this panel. So to help me report your interventions, I would kindly ask you to mention whether you are addressing a political, an economic, a social, or a technological dimension of discussion in terms of the future of Europe. So you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Piotr Buras. I'm, in my daily life, head of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. But here in Vienna, I have the privilege to be one of the fellows at the IWM in the Europe's Futures program, and now have the privilege and honor to chair this final roundtable, which is actually a sort of a half round table. But nevertheless, I think it will be an interesting exercise, and quite challenging, not only because of time, but also because of the number of participants. But my feeling is that there is, after these 2 sessions, or 3 sessions, including the initial presentations, my feeling is that there is a sort of a sense of urgency in the room and among the speakers, that lots of things should be done. I mean, in order to rescue Europe from a collapse, in order to make sure that we have a prosperous future in our parts of Europe, that the European Union should be helped to rediscover its purpose and restore its legitimacy. And very often I have the feeling that we basically finish by saying that. I mean, that this must be done, or we should achieve this or that, but we are not basically very clear about what are the next steps to be taken. And my suggestion for our speakers, because we have people from different corners and of different expertise, some of them working on economic issues, others on political, others on technological issues. My suggestion would be to be very focused in your, I would say, 3 minutes interventions, because of the time limits, and define just one very particular problem and one very particular solution, which is in your field, in your respective field, which you believe that could bring us at least one step further, because we don't need to develop, the new visions of the European Union, which then end up to be rather useless because are not implementable. But sometimes some very concrete steps are needed to achieve at least a progress on a way to somewhere. So I would be very, of course, if if you don't feel comfortable with this suggestion, so please follow your own script. But I think that would be a value in itself if we came up here with some ideas which could be then further discussed and implemented. So I know that Jakub has such an idea, and he even started developing it in his intervention. So I would perhaps start with you.
Thank you, dear Piotr. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. My idea. The question of this panel is, will the basic democratic structures hold against extremism? And the short answer is they could, but they won't be able to defend themselves. I think there is an urgent need today in Europe to protect and promote European values as they are enshrined in Article 2 rulings of the European Court of Justice and other documents. How to do it? In principle, we have two choices. The first is a corrective arm, which means that the Union reacts when the values are breached, for example, through infringement or through Article 7 or other ideas. The trouble with that is that usually those initiatives are too late and don't succeed in moving the position of the government. Plus, they are used by populist governments to claim, to portray the European Union as an evil power which interferes in domestic affairs. So while they are important, I think it would make sense to complement them with a preventive arm. And here on a preventive arm, it's important to know that this can't be done from Brussels. What could work instead would be to promote and support financially civil society organizations which work at the local and national level on the promotion of European values. To give you an example, one example was given already on the earlier panel by our great colleague from Bulgaria who does public education on Europe. Another example from Poland, there is the so-called Free Courts Initiative, where lawyers ask influencers to record short YouTube videos about why we need rule of law. And then they are spread on social media and explain to the public why they should care about the changes that are now in the judiciary in Poland. And we have thousands of such initiatives, so it would be quite easy just to support them. The Union is doing this support already big time in third countries. In the previous financial perspective, the Union spent roughly 2 billion euros on supporting NGOs promoting European values in third countries. But so far, the Union has not done it inside the Union. So now, to conclude, there is a big opportunity to change that. Because the EU is now negotiating a so-called rights and values program, which is, at least rhetorically, designed to promote European values also through the promotion of NGOs. It has, however, three problems. The first is money. The Union wants to spend 640 million euros on the whole program, but this money will be spread across a huge group of beneficiaries, including third countries, and only 15 million euros will be devoted to NGOs. So divide 50 million euros by 27 member states and 7 years to see that this instrument will have no impact in its current form. Secondly, scope, which I mentioned, and thirdly, access. For many small organizations, it's super difficult to access EU instruments. Whereas there are solutions, for example, from the Norway funds, how to make it better. So my final word will be, there is now an ongoing promotion of a more ambitious rights and values program. At this point in time, what we need most is the support of member states. I am coordinating it. If you want to participate in this, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jakub. It was almost a Punktlandung, as you call it in German. Who would like to come next? Zsuzsa?
Okay, thank you very much. I am Zsuzsa Szelényi. I'm from Hungary. I'm a politician. I was member of parliament until May. I'm not in parliament at the moment, and I'm very happy fellow of IWM in the next year. And of course, I as a Hungarian politician, I deal with rule of law in Europe somehow as a kind of basic of my exercise. Well, my couple of words on Europe's challenges. I think that basically there is a general understanding among European elites, of all kinds of elites, that Europe is in a trouble. And I mean by this trouble more than just EU itself. We are a continent which is on a decline because of, in various ways, we are losing room in the global arena. There was a lot of talk about that in the previous decade. So there is a kind of general decline of Europe. This is why, instead of going into details, but I believe this perception of losing weight globally is behind that authoritarianism or authoritarian regimes are emerging in Europe. So I think this is a very strong correlation of the status of Europe and the growing authoritarianism. My statement is, and I first-hand experience, is that it is in the mainstream. So the authoritarianism doesn't come from the fringes. It is in the European mainstream politics. And it's a huge movement which is on government in certain countries in Europe, but there are large social movements, cultural movements, which support this political authoritarianism, which we can see in certain countries on government already. So I think it's something serious and more deep and difficult to tackle than just a kind of little challenge. So I think it's a serious story which has started much earlier than just the migration crisis. It's a longer story, and therefore it's very complicated and difficult to contain it and face it. I think there is a big question whether the new authoritarians who basically tell people that they are able to challenge their problems and solve their problems with strong hand. This is their basic promise to people. This is why they are so appealing. We don't know whether it's successful or not in a world where technological revolution is and artificial intelligence and demographic decline and climate change and all kinds of translational challenges are coming to us. So I think, because Piotr asked us to say something proposal type, I think the task is more serious than just charge politicians to try to do it. There is a need for a strategic cooperation between civil society, politics, and business specifically, which is completely missing in my mind, to organize a real new vision for Europe for the future. Otherwise, we just try to contain something we don't like, but actually we do have to offer an alternative.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. No, it's almost 4 minutes. Who of you would like to come next?
Thank you. So I'm Madalina Mocan. I'm an Aspen Fellow and a Marshall Memorial Fellow. But I'm more than that, so to say. I come from Transylvania, from Cluj or Kolozsvár or Klausenburg, however you want to call it. And I'm also a very fortunate landowner in a village in Transylvania. So the idea of agricultural holdings as a key recommendation for the future of that part of Europe, made me think of all the palinka I'm producing, and I was like, no, this is not, this is not where we are going. One reason for which I strongly believe that is that I also happen to have, property rights that go back in many generations, and some of them are stamped in a chancellery not very far away from here. So being a Transylvanian, in a way, I presume makes you also very Central European. So to say, as I was saying, I won't, make comments regarding all the political theories that I might feel comfortable, but rather, again, make some personal comments about what I heard today, and especially from this perspective of what does it mean actually to have a strong sense of identity, and in this case, identity that is somehow related to the land you own. And I was actually thinking that one of the challenges of European Union is also connected with its internal, so to say, challenges, because I live in a country where, for example, land grabbing is becoming a source of discontent, and it probably is adding to the capacity of a small landowner in Romania to understand all these macro trends and whatever other big ideas that we might roam around. So that's the first comment, and obviously I do not believe in large agricultural holdings, but I do believe in some sort of a collective of the capacity to reinvent the capacity to show solidarity when it comes to working land, and then when it comes to creating communities through work. So the last comment I'm gonna make is also actually to a rhetorical question that was asked earlier on in another panel, and someone asked, what do you think of someone being hired at $250,000 in a Silicon Valley project, and doesn't that blow your mind? And my answer would be no, it doesn't. I don't know what $250,000 look like, feel like, and nor am I honestly very interested in it. But I am interested, or I would be interested to have a more profound conversation about the fact that the very success stories from such an entrepreneurial environment, such as Silicon Valley's, actually benefited from a lot of governmental support in the US, and many do use technologies that were actually heavily subsidized by the US government. So again, there are success stories, but the intervention of the state in these success stories, I think, deserves, in terms of social solidarity, more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Vladimír Bartovic from Prague. I'm director of think tank dealing with EU issues. It's very nice that this, not panel, but roundtable, everybody talks about something different, and it will be difficult probably for the rapporteurs. So, but anyway, I will also start with something different than the others. Maybe I will start with some personal observation of the environment, not only where I live in a big city, but also, let's say, where I try to spend a lot of time also at the countryside. And what I'm observing last couple of years, it's two trends that goes against each other. The one trend is that, at least in our countries in Central Europe, and correct me if I am wrong, the people never ever in the history had better life on average, yes? If they compare it with their parents, with their grandparents, and so on, both economically but also socially. But still, the second trend is that there is a growing frustration, which it's difficult to understand why. I have many examples even from my family of my cousin who is IT specialist. He's 30 years old. He has got his own flat. He has got his wife. They are expecting a child. He has nice salary, much better life than his parents and grandparents, and still frustrated. And when you ask why, it's general answers. Everything goes in wrong direction, like look at the media, look at news, look what's happening on the borders of Europe, like the corrupt politicians, and only negative things. And I was thinking, and with my colleagues we debated this many times, that what is the source of this frustration, why it is so different than our parents and grandparents. And one of the things we discovered is that people, and maybe it's that thanks to also new technology, social media, they tend more and more compare themselves with the others than it was ever before. So they are not happy enough if their life is good enough, because they still compare themselves with those who are more successful. And this is the source of frustration. And now, what we can do with it? I'm not sure if we have any power to really react on this, because it's something psychological. It cannot be proved by numbers. It can be maybe researched, but I'm probably not enough creative to give you answer what to do with it. Of course, one would say that education, but education, can we still enlarge the education or reform it enough? In Slovakia, we had problem that there is a growing, I wouldn't say directly anti-Semitism or nationalism, but let's say nationalism and a misunderstanding of important moments of the history. So we are adding classes of history. Our kids are fat. We are adding classes of sport. But we cannot just extend this educational system. So, of course, we have to reform it. We have to, first of all, provide young people an instrument which would enable them to understand, to analyze. Yeah. What we are not doing, at least the educational system in our countries, is completely missing this element. But I don't think it's the miracle solution that the reform of the educational system can all make it. Now, just last two sentences. I absolutely agree with what Bono said. It was here, it's so popular now, everybody talks about that the EU is a dot, or it should be emotion. Yes, it's nice, and I completely understand that, I support that, and especially in the moment when our kids or our population is frustrated. Those who are against us, against our way of life, like yesterday was said, the armies are ready. Probably we have to react differently than were always reacting in the past, doing our small projects and trying to involve citizens who were involved already 1,000 times. Maybe we should really completely change the way how we are doing that and react more strongly. I don't know how to find better word than to start also with kind of propaganda, you know, with simple messages, not fact-based, not telling bullshits or not lying, but really starting to be much more straightforward with the citizens.
Okay. Thank you very much. Pete.
Okay, thank you. We Dostál, the Association for International Affairs from Prague. I wanted to speak about the divisions as a challenge we've got in Europe right now, and I would like to follow on what Vlado also mentioned, because that was a very interesting example, and I very much share your observations on the situation, because we are struggling with the divisions in Europe between member states, between the center and the periphery. We think about the reality differently. The problem I see is that it's much harder to find some kind of a trade-off, to find a compromise, because and here I think is the connection with what was mentioned at the beginning, the sense of urgency. The sense of urgency we all have, also here in the room. If you listened to the opening speeches, to the speech yesterday in the evening, the sense of urgency that we have to act right now is there. And I think that it also produces this inability to accept some kind of a compromise, to accept some kind of a trade-off, because the feeling is that once you agree on compromise, then you would lose an opportunity to act in that moment of urgency. Also, what you said, Vlado, that people tend to compare themselves, and that's the reason why they are frustrated. I think that it's also connected with some kind of a materialization of our life, because we tend to compare whether we have a car or a flat, and we have a feeling that someone may take it, that we would lose it. But I think that we do not compare, for example, our personal freedoms. We do not compare the feeling that we actually have a good relations in the family with our friends. So I think that's the biggest challenge. You know, the sense of the sensitivity, some kind of a social sensitivity, which is not there in a society. Generosity, hope. I think in our personal lives we were very much losing hope and values. And I think that's the main challenge. I don't know how much does it fit to the future of Europe, or whether we should speak about policies rather than these very abstract, but in my perspective, very important issues, without which there would be still a huge group of people who would fear about the future. And that's, I think, the main problem producing all these divisions.
Yep. Thank you very much. What's next?
My name is Roxana Voicu-Dorobanțu. I'm an Aspen Fellow and with the Bucharest University of Economic Studies. And I was initially planning to speak last because there's a quote that I particularly like. And it says that we are made of the stories that we believe in, with the stories that we tell, and equally by the stories that we choose to ignore. So it's interesting to see all these stories that make up a mosaic of European life. And not to see the red thread, and red not as in communist, but you know, the idea, the common idea that's in it. Now, there are two elements that I would like to add to the discussion. Because I am academia, and because education comes up over and over again as a panacea for all the issues that European has. My question, and it links to what you said, how do we make sure that the way we educate the kids isn't actually biasing them more? Because we add history lessons, but we add some sort of aggressively revisionist history lessons. I mean, we see it in Hungary, we see it in Romania, we see it all over Europe. Now, basically everybody is the center of the universe. Well, you know, how many centers of the world can you find out, and all of them in Europe? So we also face, based on this education, the fact that the current generation, and I would like to consider myself part of it as well, is growing up with a very transient feeling of memory. Our memories are not on film, they're not on paper, they're not on rock, they're not on paintings. You know, we walk around Vienna and we see memories translated into architecture, into culture, into as well. Our memories are on phones. They're in the cloud. And we have become dependent on electricity. And if we don't have access to the cloud based on anything, you know, caused by anything, we don't have access to those memories. We don't have access to basic skills. I was discussing with a friend of mine, and his favorite saying is, if I don't have access to Google, my IQ drops 10 points. Because I don't have the basic skills, you know, I can't boil water. I don't know, there's a saying, and it appears now in the news, that in the US, youth can't send in their electoral ballots because they don't know where to buy stamps. And that's an issue that we need to face, and it relates to memory. And the second part that we need to consider is the fact that we cannot provide a single solution for all the European Union regions. And I'm using the word regions and not countries, because if you have a look at Romania's regions, you will see that Bucharest, and that's the case for most of the newly members of the EU, Bucharest resembles and may be clustered with the poorer regions in Germany or with the more prosperous regions in Italy. It doesn't resemble the rest of Romania. So we cannot apply the same solution for Bucharest as we apply to the poorest regions in Romania. Because in the poorest regions, you might have issues like, in some cases, lack of electricity or lack of utilities. And in other, basic analphabetism. So you cannot decide a single solution for everything, and that solution to be education. How can you educate when you still have, and that's a saying that you find in Romania, and I'm sure the Prime Minister encountered it. How can you have proper education when you don't have electricities, when you don't have utilities in school, and so on and so forth? So the solution, because you've asked for the solution, and to wrap up, there was a talk about digitalization and digitization and so on and so forth. And we give out lots and lots of data to private companies and to our own governments. The idea is, how can the European Union and the national government use that data? Protect it, yes, true, but how can they use it in order to generate real data-driven policies that are tailor-made for the issues of the regions? Not just say, okay, that's the basic statistics of the EU, and which is also important to know, but to provide targeted solutions which may allow poorer regions to leapfrog, as for instance, Africa has done. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. So Prime Minister, you were asked to react, so please.
Since it comes from a fellow Romanian. Good evening, my name is Mihai Răzvan Ungureanu, and I'm currently a fellow to the IWM. I teach at the University in Bucharest and at the Diplomatic Academy here in Vienna. Let me begin with a bit of personal experience. That's true, I have something like 18 years of public office experience behind my back, and I happen to be one of the 4 signatories of Romania's accession treaty to the European Union. It wasn't on merit, it just happened. But in a way, it rhymed at the time, some good years ago, with my very deep feeling that this is exactly what my country of origin needs to build a secure and prosperous future. Now, I have to admit, I could have never imagined Brexit would have happened. And when the results of the vote came out, I felt it like a shock, and I took it very personal. Because I then imagined the worst situation I could have been subjected to realize that I've been fighting for a project, maybe, for an ideal, completely losing what it should be called like a realism. And I hope my predecessor in the ministerial position of Foreign Affairs, Minister Mircea Joana, my friend, had never experienced it, although it's quite unlikely. In the past 2 decades, Europe has gone through lots of political tumults. And cases like Brexit, the Greek crisis, immigration crisis, all of them have had set precedents. We had never had this kind of experience before. Now, it is likely that we could repeat them. Precedents are traumatic. But since I don't want this meeting of ours to become a sort of a psychotherapy common kind of gathering, I would just say that I looked in the past months prior to joining you here, and once again, thank you for inviting me, into the last Eurobarometers and research papers that have been based on public questioning in the past couple of years. And my focus was mostly the political rhetorics and how political rhetorics could drop good solutions and transform them into desirable solutions at popular level throughout the European Union. This having in mind what Ivan Vejvoda's project is about. And I try to wind it up as quick as possible. There are several divides here. I'm not referring to geographical divides, geopolitical divides, and so on. There is a divide between the rhetorics, the political rhetorics of elites and the rhetorics of the public in general. Whereas common attitudes can be seen at the level of EU solidarity, democracy, or a certain sense of European identity, the differences have to be marked when it comes to general attitudes, to beliefs, or to life experiences. Paradoxically, the elite looks like more liberal and optimistic, at least rhetorically, and shares EU benefits. Please do not forget that Nigel Farage was a member of the European Parliament. He enjoyed every inch bit of privileges European parliamentarians do enjoy. Whereas the public is discontent, cries for powers to be turned back to the state, most in the case of migrants, are anxious, and they share a very toxic sense of lacking security. And when I say this, I have in mind that my country of origin, is now the most important, quote-unquote, donor of youth, of young working force to the European Union. The second divide is between liberal-minded communities and authoritarian-minded communities, particularly on identity issues. And this very divide plays a stronger role in shaping attitudes toward the European Union, thus going into political challenges. It plays on the domestic political scene, into populism, ethno-nationalism, and discrimination. The third divide is between the members of the elite themselves, because there is a lack of consensus on important questions addressing the EU's direction. Although the elite, again, enjoys large benefits from the European Union, it's far from united in attitudes to further integration, to solve somehow the very antagonistic relationship between deepening the European Union and expanding or enlarging it. And it has no answers whatsoever among the members of the elite about the balance of how the balance of power should be shifted between the EU and the member states, or about a federalist scheme. What I think that we have to go over is the binary debate. And everything looks like rhetorically revolving around the binary debate. Core, periphery, north-south, east-west, and so on and so forth. What I think that we need, again, at the level of political discourses, is an integration agenda that recognizes the diversity of perspectives on Europe's future and moves beyond crude notions of more or less Europe. That would be open, imaginative, and if necessary, conflictual. And I think that we should stand up and fight forth for these kind of ideas. It should be a flexible approach to future integration more than that core periphery EU debate. And by the way, multi-speed integration for me is a nonsense. Why? Because it ignores the fact that important fault lines cut across the continent as a whole. It's impossible to discuss about different speeds in Europe. It's like forgetting that the EU is very much matching the continent's limits. Divides between the public are as important as division between the states. And political rhetorics addressing the European public should require different strategies when addressed. Is not about the same kind of discourse. A reorientation of the rhetorics of leaders and national politicians is again important, because it should address the gap between the political attitude, the elite's attitudes, and the attitudes of the citizens, mostly on deeper social issues which are divisive, such as fears over loss of national identity, pressures of immigration, perceived unequal access to opportunities. And finally, debates need to be reframed in this sense and should somehow take the pressure off concerns about the perceived threat to national traditions and culture. And in a way also, if possible, respond to anxieties over economic performance. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And last but not least,
thank you very much. I'm Yasen, Georgiev, heading the Economic Policy Institute in Sofia. A think tank works at the intersection between economy and politics. I have a lot to add to this, but let me focus on personal experience. 8 years ago, I attended a public lecture by Papandreou, at that time the Prime Minister of Greece, in Berlin at the Humboldt University. And he claimed that thanks to Greece, the euro area was able to test its risk management mechanisms. At that time, I was laughing, saying, okay, I mean, it's not serious, but I think thanks to all this series of crises, we are able to think more critically about the European Union. Of course, I should say in one sentence, the European Union is much more resilient than it looks like to the world outside. Because remember at the time when the euro crisis started, many scientists, many researchers said the eurozone is over, it is dead. But look now, it's still here, although it's not perfect. During the migrant crisis, we all expected that the European Union will fall apart. Of course, there are many difficulties between countries in the central part of Europe and border countries like Greece, like Italy and Spain, but still the EU is there. Look at the Brexit. I mean, before Brexit, we tend to believe that integration and democracy maybe is only a one-way street. But now we see that in the world today, it is not the case. So I should say that all these challenges are good enough for us to realize how fragile we are. And on the basis of this sense, we could think what is necessary in order to go ahead. Is there any alternative to what we have right now or not? Because I should quote here Trudeau in Davos this year, who said, "The pace of the changes never been this fast yet, and it will never be this slow again." So this is something which has been already mentioned, this sense of urgency. And I think having in mind our weaknesses is also a strong point, because we know where our fragile points are, and we can try to fix them. Otherwise, we could try to think about the beautiful future without knowing where the bottlenecks are. So I think in this situation, we are at least much more aware of our problems. And of course, when speaking about the future, we have always to challenge the populist parties by asking them, what is the alternative? What is the cost of this non-Europe? Whether we should trade only internally between our borders, or we could somehow resist the challenges coming from Asia. And the thing is that we might not love each other, but we might be forced to go ahead. Because let me recall the first years after the World War II. I don't believe that at that time Germans and French people loved very much each other. But at that time, they were able to, maybe based on hate and mistrust, to build something which is forward-looking, something which is much bigger than them at that time. So I think we should firstly think about the alternative and not to be afraid that we don't love each other so much right now. But we have to look at the common denominator and based on this to work for the future.
Yeah, thank you very much for all these interventions here. And I have the feeling that we all somehow agreed that there is a sense of urgency, but there's another sense which I also detected in all these interventions, the sense of fragility and vulnerability of the world and of the European project we have now. And I would like to, before I give you the floor and also let the other participants perhaps respond to each other, we have only 15 minutes left, but still there is time for some interventions. I would like to very briefly pick up on 2 points which were made by Vlado and by Mr. Ungurano on this division lines, new division lines in our societies, and on perhaps the need to get more emotional about Europe or about values or about, and I would even call it more political in a way. Because I think that when it comes to this, as also a think tank community or as, civil activists or whoever we are, because I think, in fact, when it comes to the division lines, these new cleavages, when you go to the EU level, I think I would even argue that the situation is even more fundamental than you described it. That we have 2 big questions, I think, in Europe today related to the issues we discussed here. The first is, can we have a European Union which is based upon the idea of constitutional pluralism, which is actually basically a EU principle, which basically would mean that we have very different various political systems within the European Union. So I think there are some who believe that it's absolutely impossible. But there are some, I think, who don't want to leave the European Union, but still believe that the European Union could include countries of liberal, democratic regime, semi-authoritarian, maybe even authoritarian or illiberal whatsoever. So I think this is a very fundamental division line. And the other division line is related to the values. I mean, can we have a European Union, which is indeed, as Jan Jakub indicated, which does not respect those values which we have enshrined in the Article 2 of the EU Treaty? I mean, do we want to have this kind of cooperation based upon some different values, or not really following the Human Rights Convention and many others legal acts signed by the European Union and its member states? I think these are the key questions which bring me to your point about this, standing up and maybe getting more, not only more emotional but also more political about defending a certain set of values and certain set of principles which used to be, obvious and uncontested, but no longer, are not so any longer. But that was a slightly too long a comment from my side. But so if there are some interventions here, I would, Jan Jakub.
I would like to react to Vladimír and end with 2 proposals. If I had to recommend one book, which enlightens us the most about what is going on. It is Age of Anger by Pankaj Mishra. Pankaj argues that what we are observing now, this angriness building up in people, and the exploitation of this angriness by populists is nothing new. It goes back to a fundamental debate of the Enlightenment between Voltaire and Rousseau. Short story. A society which is based on meritocracy and competitiveness is an inbuilt production mechanism of frustration. Because no matter how you try, there are certain things which you can't achieve. And even if you achieve them, you need to constantly fight to keep them. And the problem of our societies is that we educate our young people as competitors, then they fail, most of them will fail, and then the populists come and tell them, look, your sense of worth is not dependent on becoming a CEO or becoming a director. It's because you are Polish. So from this follow two proposals or ideas. The first is, and this is definitely a task for intellectuals, to answer the question, what are sources of personal worth which are neither based on competition nor on excluding people? Maybe this could be something which the EVM researchers, and since we have excellent empirical social scientists, anything which comes out from this research could be empirically tested across Europe to identify which of those senses of worth work best in different countries. So that could be a research, a very practical political research agenda. And the second thing is that we cannot stop at the academic bubble, but we need an army of leaders who would rally people in their countries around those values. And here, I think this is a task for foundations, for example. We should ask ourselves seriously the question, how do we get good, talented people into politics? Which means you have to change on the pull side political parties and make them more attractive for people. For example, collecting all the knowledge about what political parties do to become more attractive also for the young generation is something which, to my knowledge, has not been done yet, although individual parties like SPD keep thinking in isolation. And on the push side, I think we should also engage more in convincing people to get into politics. And I know this is very difficult because politics has a very bad reputation. But for example, in the States, there is this initiative called Run for Something, which is basically headhunting people for political offices. They look at the local level, and whoever stands out, for example, because he writes an article or raises his voice at an assembly, is contacted by this NGO, and they keep convincing him as long as it takes so that he runs for an office, and if he does, they help him, give him a starting grant, give him advice on how to do social media and how to structure a campaign. So since we have all this money in foundations, why not do something like that for Europe?
Thank you. I would like to really support what Jakub said, especially with, I think many times we are just not implementing enough data-based approach because, for example, our institute always focused on promoting the European integration, for example, through explaining people million times like how it is fantastic in the EU because we have freedom of travel. Now, in a research project we did in the last couple of months, we realized that it's the least important thing for the people. It's on the last place. If you ask them what is important in the EU integration, they acknowledge that it's achievement of the EU integration, but they do not consider it absolutely as important. It's on the last place. On the first place is security, where they consider the EU as a negative player. In their opinion, the EU is, membership in the EU is lowering their security. So what we can do are two ways. First, we can try to elevate the importance of those things which we find important and where the EU is a champion. And also, we can focus on those which are naturally important for the people and explaining them what is the truth, what is the correct. So this is one thing I wanted to say, and from my side, I promise that my institute will more and more rely on this kind of data and focus group. And the second thing is just not to be too negative on what's happening. I was talking a lot with older, not older generation, but let's say more mature generation of people, even people who lived before the Second World War, and they told me like, and they were observing the whole process, for example, of European integration. They said just open the newspapers. If you are frustrated what's happening now, open the newspapers anytime in the history. Oil crisis, the crisis with France ignoring the European communities. All the time in the history we saw this big titles in the newspapers like it's the end of European dream and so on and so on. So even older generations had this problem. So maybe sometimes we are a little bit exaggerating, or we are so focused only on what's happening right now exactly.
Can I make a small comment? Yeah, if you. Yeah. And then you say I just wanted to say that I find it deeply concerning, this idea that the sense of whatever it is European, or the sense of self-worth, should be defined by intellectuals. I think that the European Union is pretty much a strong and honest conversation with people that, for example, are going and work like migrant jobs in Portugal, in those agricultural holdings that are most of the time, that they are exploited in Portugal while picking up olives, and it's still way a much better life than being unemployed in some parts in Romania. So that's also a conversation that maybe we should listen more to what Europe means to them, speaking of the right to travel, the freedom of traveling, because for them actually this is a very important European attribute. So maybe that's another perspective that could be added. Thank you.
Just one, I come back to your comments. I think everything can be squarely put down into a couple of words. Win politicians back. This is very important. It's fantastic to think that NGOs and clear-minded and sunny-minded people could exercise that kind of bottom-up education that in the end would turn politicians from devils into angels. That's fantastic. The problem is that since the European Union was invented top-down, treatment needs to be done top-down. So I think that this should be the principal target, win them back. And one cannot win them back without showing and explaining again and again which are the positive results of EU membership at the level of average EU citizen. Because that's where the EU is translated, the EU membership is translated into physical results. May it be the liberty of travel, may it be, I don't know, whatever else, out of the 4 liberties and subsequent consequences of membership. Second, it lays into the power of communities to press upon politicians or upon academics or upon people like ourselves gathered here in this room for answers, for clear answers, no matter whether they're risky or they could entail negative consequences upon the future of Europe. Up to this very point, we know 4 basic scenarios, and everybody steps short of accepting one of them. The first is how can we muddle through? And this is what happens now, because I cannot foresee any new treaty that would be signed in the foreseeable future. The second is multi-speed Europe, 2, 3, 4, n speeds of Europe. A looser integration, that is powers back to the nation state, or a tighter integration. I cannot see a fifth scenario, but at least, for God's sake, we should imagine through what we do that at least one of them could be better than the others.
Thank you very much. We are quickly running out of time, but I have Zsuzsa now, and then I will need an advice from Clara, and even if we can pick up a question from the audience, one question, or because
I was going to ask the questions.
all right. so two questions, okay.
So there are two questions.
Well, I find very fascinating this discussion, actually, which was really not designed in any way. We hardly had any title, but I like it so much. And I just was very inspired by many things what you said in terms of which I consider a kind of major mission of figuring out a positive vision for Europe's future, which is kind of general framework of my way of thinking for actually many years now. And as you said, Vlado, that people are always looking for others, what's still better than how we live. Of course, we are very vulnerable people, and we are never happy of anything because there is always something better. But the question is whether this kind of this perception of our life or status is a source of frustration, or is it a source of inspiration? And I think what we probably can understand in Central Europe together is that usually that's a sense of frustration, but we can put it into a source of inspiration. And I was inspired by some of you, what you said. So if I would like to start to list what a kind of future vision for Europe should look like, it first of all should be very future-oriented. We are bad in learning from the past. And people are basically interested in present and the future. And this is why politics is always speaking about the future, however, usually speaks very real time. But this is, we do it because that's what people are interested in. And this is very human. I think it's natural. So this should be about telling how we Europeans will live in 10, 15, 20 years. Another thing which I think was that you said, which was very important, I think, that this material values versus mental, community, human values. Well, I think we just simply will not live as good as we lived. There are many forecasts which say that we just simply cannot maintain this level of wealth in Europe in the future. So we do have to reconsider seriously what is important for us. And of course we know very much that people, friends, family around us is actually so much more important than how much money we have. But we are not aware of that. So I think it's important that in a future of Europe vision, we have to relate human relationship. Also, that people feel that they are taken seriously, so some kind of participative manner, which also kind of very Central European experience that we felt, and this is why we are here, that often we felt we were not taken seriously, and figuring out a new economic model. We are really in trouble with our economic model, we know. But of course, we do need some political leadership, so we just cannot forget politicians, and I agree very much with you that we have to, I mean, you both spoke about that we have to renew politics and find new politicians as well.
So thank you very much. I think we have 3 minutes altogether left, but please, here's one question, there's another one.
I don't need the mic. No, please use it. Maybe Thank you for the speech and discussions. I have just a few questions. So, maybe just, yeah, because I was thinking about this 5G technology that you use in the big cities like Vienna, Washington, and the matter of collective unconsciousness. So I've worked on the theory of everything and the hard problem of consciousness, and I registered it in the University of Vienna. So we proved the alternatives are really important. And as Alan Badiou mentions, and Wittgenstein also in the family resemblance, because we don't stick just to the nationality or the countries, we stick into the values which are defined by each family. And each person is grown in specific families. And each family has its own values maybe, or its own Erziehungssystem, or this educational system. So I thought the matter of medium is now very important, not medias, because medias is again this binary system that you mentioned, which goes to retrocausality. It's interesting, but there is no achievement or no crediting system in these systems. The point is that how we can create the first social medium that can support the young generation in different segments. As you mentioned, we have elites, public, and the politicians. But the elites that I confronted in Asia and also in United States were supported, kind of, but in European Union, it's a little bit hard for the elites to be supported financially and also intellectually because of the function of the psyche, maybe, of the West. It's more self-biased.
Thank you.
Thank you. A short an interlinked question for three participants, so I'll be super effective. Now, for Vladimír and Vit, you talked a lot about identity as opposed to economic grievances, but there are a lot of studies, for example, EUROPEUM, that show that both intergenerational and intragenerational mobility has fallen. So there's a slight, let's say, tension with your assertion that people are living better off than before. A lot of the people in the European Union are not, so there is a legitimate economic grievance. And then coming back to identity divisions, and that's the question for Prime Minister Ungureanu, to what extent are these new rhetorical divisions artificially created by national elites for furthering their political agenda or simply electoral gains? Because as opposed to traditional cleavages, these are coming up in such a short amount of time and usually before elections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now, whoever feels like answering.
Yeah, you are absolutely right that not all the people are doing much better than their parents and grandparents. I was maybe mainly talking about the Czech Republic and Slovakia, this kind of Central Europe, where still the differences are among the lowest between European nations. So the difference between so people in extreme poverty and people extremely rich. And the biggest problem in our societies with extreme poverty is related to loans and to indebtedness of people who just had risky behavior. They fallen into debt traps and they are not able to get out from them. And this is a problem. But if we are talking about people, how they feel, I give you just concrete example. Before, people were never dreaming about the possibility to go for a vacation to Croatia, let's say, yeah? It was not an option. So when they were not able to go, it was not source of their frustration because it was not their dream, you know, it was not their intention. But now people, they know what are the options, what are the possibilities, how the others can live, and they miss these opportunities. They are frustrated that they cannot do the same like their neighbor. So that I wanted, that I meant by that kind of frustration. But of course, I acknowledge that there are people who are doing really, really bad.
Yeah.
10 seconds comment
yes, please.
on what you said. True. Some people are living better and they can travel abroad, but I have the example of my 90-year-old neighbors, and they have this nostalgia of communist times because then they had one summer vacation, true, in a very crowded Romanian place, and they had one winter vacation in a very crowded Romanian place. And post-communist, they don't, because they can't afford it. So for them, that's actually a non-issue. I mean, they don't compare themselves to going not even to Bulgaria, which is right across the border. They compare to what they were 20 years ago. So that would stress the need of actually not seeing Europe as a conglomerate, but looking at granular data.
Yeah, thank you. Vít?
Yes, I think you are right, and that was actually not my point. It is definitely interesting to see, if you look at the data in the Central and Eastern Europe, or at least in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland as well. Poland is an interesting case, because if you look at the public opinion surveys, it shows that people declare that that their quality of living is still better. In 2015, it was again one of the peaks of when people said that their financial situation, the financial situations of the people as they are, is the best actually ever. And still, the then government, lost the elections against a party which promised a change, a huge change of the system of the country. So, it is interesting how to translate it into the political action. But my point was rather to not about the economic grievances, which are of course there, but also to look at our values in our lives, feelings that we cherish and that are important to make our lives full and complete. And my feeling is that this is more and more neglected with all these appeals of urgency of today, but it should not be left out from our lives and from the politics as well, social reality. So that was my point.
Thank you. Last comment, but please very short, because really short.
Thank you for your question. The answer is yes. The truth is that it's a vicious circle. It's difficult to interrupt it in a way that it would not just replicate itself ad infinitum. Yes, whenever a crack appears in the local psychology, social psychology of a community, there will be always a political character trying to pick it up for the sake of votes. This is normal. This is the mechanism of politics. Let's not be shy about this. What is unfortunately present is this disenchantement, this kind of divorce from the early original European dream. And this comes together with a very consciousness of not finding direct, proper, pragmatic solutions to traumas. And the immigrants' crisis actually proved that the European Union is at the brink of a specific kind of tiredness that has plagued Europe in the past 200 years. It's the so-called diversity tiredness. And diversity tiredness installed itself with the second last wave of new enlargement with Romania and Bulgaria. That's where the things have been completely cracked down, and the plan of enlargement has become has been replaced with a potential deepening EU integration. Romania and Bulgaria were swallowed difficultly. But imagine now what would happen in the Balkans. I mean, everything that's spoken about Serbia, although we all know that this is a compulsory step into making the European Union a bit functional, is just warm, hot air. At least in this moment, this is why we need to win politicians back.
Thank you very much. That was the last intervention in this roundtable. Thank you very much for your participation, your comments and speeches. And now I would like to pass the floor to Clara and Ivan for the concluding remarks, right? And perhaps join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much. We've really run out of time, so I hope that Clara and I will keep this extremely brief. This is supposed to be a recapitulation of the day's events, and so I'll kind of chuck away my notes and try and focus on what I think this roundtable brought so painfully clearly to us. And not to try and oversimplify, but I think we're still living the effects of the financial and economic crisis, which is the underpinning of what's going on, not to be too Marxist about it and put everything on the economics. But people have a sense of lack of certainty about tomorrow, whether those who have jobs, digitization, automation, all that, will I have a job tomorrow? And those who don't have jobs or precarious jobs, will we ever have jobs again? And I think that's a lot of the source of frustration among the various younger people. And then, of course, the fate of Europe in the world, which Andreas Streichel so eloquently talked about. You know, are we going to sink or swim? In a diminishing demographic Europe, in a world that is demographically rising in Africa, China, and elsewhere, economically rising in the US and Asia. As we see, if I can be a bit brutal, our European leaders nitpicking or navel-gazing in their domestic politics, will they survive or not survive? And as the sort of ship of Europe muddles through in rather stormy waters, we are all expecting to see some bigger decisions, and I think that's what comes out of the various interventions that we heard. Will, you know, Andreas talked about, you know, the Franco-German engine that doesn't seem to be kind of, you know, being put into second, third, and fourth gear. We're sort of in first gear. And the fact that we don't have growth in Europe in the way that we did have before the economic crisis. Yes, in certain countries, and Romania was highlighted, my country, Serbia, has somewhat better growth. But all in all, you know, the outlook is not good. And that links obviously then to the micro level, and I'm very glad that you all told stories and took a personal angle, because I think it is about telling stories. And I very much agree with what was said on the one hand about civic education. We've somehow lost that, but also with a variety of comments that were made that, you know, it's about politics. I don't want to say it's the politics stupid, because I think that's too easy, but we need to come back to a sort of, use whatever word you want, ennobling of politics or the comeback of politics, and making, having people understand, even if they don't want to go into politics, to understand that without politics we won't get out of this. And that being cynical about politicians, being totally, they're all the same kind of discourse, won't get us anywhere. And that means that one has to be engaged in one way or another every day, because democracy is reinvented and preserved and protected every day. It's not something that's out there to be given. Democracy, very simply, was won in the streets of various European and other capitals or through institutions. And that's where the emotion is extremely important, but if it's not underpinned by politics and institutions, it'll all fall apart. And I would say that's where the success of the European Union is, that it has created institutions that for now have resisted the tectonic movements that have been tremendous over the past time. One of you alluded, I think it was you, Yasen, you know, I lived in Washington for 6 years. Every other day they pronounced the end of the European Union or the end of the Euro, and, you know, it was just unbearable to read. A very superficial understanding of what Europe has actually achieved, But to keep that achievement, much more needs to be done. So I'll leave it at that. And I think that is really somehow the message that came through.
Obviously, I would be redundant to try to recap this day in front of you after this very, very sharp synthetic presentation of what was covered. Now, what I will propose is to report in writing, in the sense that I will draft a paper on what was discussed today and send it circulated to all of you participants, especially the speakers, with the kind request to add any data studies you have in support of your arguments, and maybe together to put forward a report of this meeting. So I will take upon myself to be the secretary and then communicate my reports in writing, because I know we're out of time.
Okay. While thanking the panel, I'd also like to thank at the very end our partners in putting this together, but I'd like to in particular thank Dana and Dino, who really did the heavy lifting, but then of course Mircea and Jiří and the other ERSTE Foundation and ERSTE Bank who made this possible. So I hope this is just the beginning of a long friendship, as the Casablanca movie says, and that we will be meeting more often in with the same mission and the same passion to put the agenda of Europe forward, both at the macro and micro level. So thank you very much. Hi. How are you? Very good.
I'm from